Hi, my name's John Brentnell and I'm a retired deacon living in Berry on the south coast of New South Wales. I recently was invited by the Lithgow Environment Group and Lithgow Uniting Church congregation to come and speak to a forum about my experiences when I was in ministry in the northwest of New South Wales and what I got up to and the motivation behind it. The talk wasn't recorded on the night, and Jason John asked if I would record the talk in this artificial environment of my study back in Berry. So this is what I'm doing tonight. So I started off telling the group there in Lithgow that I began my placement with the Liverpool Plains Resource Ministry area, which included the congregations of Gunnedah, Corindai and Werris Creek, and I was there for just under 3 years. And that time roughly coincided with the time when the Frontline Action on Coal group, otherwise known as FLAC, was established and built its campaign against the Whitehaven coal mine in the Laird Forest at Maules Creek, just out from Narrabri. I'd had a growing concern about the environment for some time before I went to the northwest, and this had been stimulated by the Al Gore movie An Inconvenient Truth, which I actually screened in Berry when it first came out. 2 people came on that night, but no members of the congregation. And I moved to Gunnedah, to live in Gunnedah on the Liverpool Plains, knowing that there'd been underground coal mining in that area for a long time. My mother had grown up in Boggabri and we'd visited there regularly, so I was vaguely aware of the coal mine there. And I'd been hearing on the news about new developments being planned in coal mining and gas exploration, and I knew that there was some controversy about that. So I knew as I was going up there that I would probably be on a steep learning curve about all of those issues, and I was keen to find out as much as possible about what was happening and what the outcomes would be, and about how that was affecting the population of the towns that I'd be working with. I discovered that in Gunnedah there was a Catholic priest who was very social justice minded and was quite opposed to any new fossil fuel extraction protests, and he'd been trying to recruit some of the local churches and ministers to issue a public call on the state government to protect farmland and wilderness areas and water resources from those kinds of activities. None of the other ministers were inclined to do that, but I said to him that I would, and eventually one other minister did. And we issued our statement, and Ron Perrott, who was the Catholic priest, had contacts with all of the local radio, TV and print media in the northwest, and our statement went public in December 2012. So in a cartoon in the Corindai newspaper just before Christmas, we were depicted as the 3 wise men. Then in February of 2013, we had a presbytery meeting of the New England Northwest Presbytery, and I put a proposal to them that the presbytery should issue a similar call to the one that the 3 of us had issued in Gunnedah. And I'd been expecting some opposition to that and some debate, and having to have a strong case to get that passed. But I was quite surprised at how quickly and how easily that proposal was passed. There didn't seem to be any dissent at all. And after we'd passed that resolution, somebody jumped up and said, well, we've done that, what are we going to do next? So after some discussion, we decided to take a proposal to the next synod meeting, and that synod in 2013 did pass that proposal that the moderator write to the Premier with a similar call to protect farmland and wilderness and water resources from the effects of coal and CSG exploration. That was quite an environmental synod, because it was at that meeting that synod also decided to divest its fossil fuel shares. And it was the first to do so, I think, and since then other synods and the Assembly have passed similar resolutions. In the meantime, I'd become connected with a group that was concerned about CSG. They were mainly farmers who were alarmed about the prospect of a gas pipeline being constructed across their properties, and quite a few of them lived around the Malali area, and so they called their group the Malali Gas Pipeline Accord. But as time went by, their concerns widened to be not just about the pipeline, but about the whole issue of CSG extraction and its effect on the agricultural industry, and as well as the local communities and the global environment. And so I attended meetings of that group through 2013 and participated in some little pop-up protests outside the Santos office in Gunnedah, and quite a big protest out in the Pilliga Forest near some sites where Santos was doing some work there. That was in February of 2014. Interestingly, Santos had heard that the ABC's TV cameras were going to be there, so they gave everybody the day off work. There wasn't any activity for the cameras to film. Then, in March of 2014, I participated in a protest outside one of the entrances to the Whitehaven coal mine site in the Laird State Forest, as I said, at Maules Creek. This had been organised by Thea Ormerod, the President of the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, with the acronym ARC. And the protesters that day included lay and ordained people from the Catholic, Anglican and Uniting Church denominations, and a member of the Buddhist faith. And 3 people were arrested that day for taking part in that protest. They were Thea, Gil Burrows and Byron Smith. I then went on to give the group in Lithgow a dramatic explanation of what happened when I became involved in the next protest in June, once again out in the Laird Forest. And I described for the group what it was like for me to go to bed late after planning what we were going to do the next day, about how I didn't sleep very well, partly because of a combination of excitement and anxiety, and not to mention the cold. And then being woken at 4 o'clock in the morning and fumbling, trying to get dressed, things that normally I didn't have any trouble with, like buttons and zips, suddenly became major obstacles. I talked about getting into a car with 3 other people and following a couple of other cars around some back roads in that area. And then when the drivers of the cars turned off their lights and crawled quietly to a particular spot, and we all jumped out and headed up the road to a place looking for another group who were supposed to meet us there. That group popped out of the bushes suddenly and moved us to another spot that they'd pre-selected, and some of them ducked back into the bush and rolled out a 44-gallon drum that had been cut in half and had a cross-shaped lock-on device fitted into it, concreted in. The whole thing weighed 80 kilograms apparently. And so these people positioned the drum in the middle of the road, and they got me and Byron to kneel on either side of it, and then proceeded to fasten the thing to the road with star pickets. As I was kneeling there and with Byron on the other side, we put our arms into the cross and wrapped the locking cables around our wrists and snapped it closed. And all the while I'm thinking, I wonder how long it'll take for security to discover us. We did find out later that they'd timed the event to coincide with the shift changeover time for the security guards, so that gave us an extra few minutes to get settled into position. At this point, someone said we should pray, and so we each took turns to say a prayer. And those that have seen the little video that FLAC and ARC have had on their websites will have seen us there kneeling in the middle of the road trying to think of words to say in a prayer. And I must admit that at 6 o'clock in the cold, my brain wasn't working very well, so my prayer was a bit hesitant. And the contrast with Byron, the PhD candidate alongside me, who always seems to know the right words to say at any point, was pretty dramatic. And then somebody set up a floodlight and put a video camera on a tripod and walked up in front of us and pointed the camera at each of us in turn and said, "Say something." And as I said, at 6 o'clock, when it's cold, my brain doesn't work very well. So once again, I struggled to think of something intelligent and inspirational to say. And a few disjointed sentences somehow fell out of my mouth, and I was glad when the cameraman moved on to the next person. So by this time, the ground was starting to feel quite hard and my knees were beginning to complain, so we asked for chairs and blankets and got ourselves settled in for a long wait. And then John Carroll and Gil Burrows settled in on either side of Byron and myself and had their ankles chained to our ankles. It wasn't that long before security arrived, and of course they were quite upset and wanted us to leave, but when we refused, they hurried off to ring the police. And it wasn't long after that the first truck came down the road and discovered our roadblock. I was a bit anxious about what sort of attitude the truckies would have towards us, but I was pleasantly surprised that they all seemed to be quite chatty, and when they were offered cups of tea and pieces of cake, they were happy to accept those, and some of them even said that they agreed with our cause, but a job was a job, so they drove trucks and delivered equipment for the mine just to earn a living. A couple of police arrived from Narrabri, and once again they weren't very happy to see where we were and what we were doing, and made all sorts of threatening noises and issued dire warnings and offered us the opportunity to unlock and leave, but once again we refused. So off they went to ring for police rescue to come and cut us out. Apparently they had to come from either Dubbo or Newcastle, so once again we knew that we were there for quite some time before they would arrive. And eventually they did arrive and cut the chains for John, and it was actually Thea by this time. Gil had become ill and had to unlock, and Thea, who hadn't intended to get arrested that day, stepped in and took her place. So after all of that, the four of us were arrested and charged, and then later on had to go through the business of court appearances and so forth. A little while after that, some of the FLAC media people started producing memes with photos of the different ones of us, and quoting things that we'd said. And for me, it was not long after Tony Abbott had said something along the lines of the worst thing that we could do would be to stop developing coal resources at that time. So my response to that was that the worst thing we could do was to continue to develop fossil fuel resources. I guess looking back, when we look at that campaign, it actually failed because the mine continued to be established and then to go into production. And in the process, large sections of the Laird Forest have been destroyed, and I suspect that all of the Indigenous sacred sites have been destroyed in the process. One of the reasons that I think it failed is that it was never able to attract the kind of numbers of protectors, the critical mass that politicians would take notice of. I think at its peak there might have been 200 or so in the camp, and over that period of about 3 years, about 350 people were arrested. By contrast, around the same time, the Bentley campaign against the CSG proposal up on the north coast had a couple of thousand people at its peak. And I think those kind of numbers were critical to the success of that campaign. And a similar situation, I think, applied with the Gloucester campaign against the AGL proposal. They got big numbers there. And I think Gloucester and Bentley had the advantage of being closer to population centres, although it didn't seem to stop protectors in the Laird Forest coming from Melbourne and Brisbane and all over the place. So FLAC is active now in the campaign against the development of the Adani mine, and we can only hope that that they're more successful in that campaign than they were in the Laird. I then went on to talk about why I've taken part in these kinds of non-violent direct actions. And I guess a lot of the reasons that I did those things would be pretty much the same as the other protectors there, in that I see mines like Whitehaven and the Santos gas proposal as destroyers of the environment at two levels. And first, of course, is the local environment, the effects on that. As I said, destruction of the Laird Forest was a big factor. Ultimately, about 70% of that forest will be destroyed. It'll tear down the last remnant of white box forest, destroy the habitat of nearly 500 species of flora and fauna, and that includes approximately 28 endangered species. And similar issues exist in the Pilliga. If that development goes ahead, there will be damage to the forest, destruction of flora and fauna, and there's some threatened species there as well. Then there's the impact on local agriculture, and the big issue here is the threat to water. This whole area depends on aquifers, and it's recharge zone for the Great Artesian Basin. So if the aquifers are affected, it's going to affect the viability of agriculture in that region, and of course that'll affect the livelihoods of many farming families. Also, a number of towns in that area rely on the artesian water for their water supply. The Whitehaven mine has the potential to lower the water table in that area by 2 to 7 metres. And so it's just going to have a huge effect on agriculture and the people who live in the towns like Narrabri and Gunnedah in that area. Another aspect of decreasing the value of the farmland and making it unviable is that for a lot of farmers, this is their big asset. This is their superannuation fund for when they retire. So if their farms lose value, they don't just lose the value of their land and their livelihood, they lose the potential to have a retirement nest egg when that time comes. Another issue with mining in the Laird Forest is the toxic dust that's created, particularly in the explosions that take place as they're removing the overburden before they get to the coal. That particular forest is in a kind of a bowl, and when the dust rises up, it circles around, and you can often see quite clearly the discoloration in the dust, which is the result of toxic chemicals floating around, and then it's got the potential to contaminate farmland that it drops down on and onto the homes of the people that live around that area as well. Another issue that worries me is the sight of these coal trains with 85 or more uncovered coal cars rumbling through every town and village between Narrabri and Newcastle, with all those millions of microparticles of coal dust floating over the town and into the lungs of the people who happen to live in proximity to the rail line. And as we know from the experience in Queensland, in the gas fields there, that CSG has terrible effects on the health of people who live in proximity to the wells. There are lots of evidence of people with nosebleeds and rashes and headaches and other symptoms. So there are lots of bad outcomes at the local level. And of course, when we think about the world environment, we all know the contribution that burning fossil fuels makes to global warming and climate change and to sea level rise. There are 2 coal mines in the Laird Forest and one right on the edge, and as I said, they'll eventually destroy 70% of the forest. If the Santos proposal goes ahead, there's a potential for 30,000 wells between the Liverpool Range, just west of Murrurundi, and the Queensland border. And these projects are proposed or taking place at a time when the World Bank says that the science is unequivocal, that humans are the cause of global warming, and that major changes are already being observed. We know there's lots of evidence of that. And the Carbon Tracker initiative said some years ago that between 60 and 80% of coal and oil and gas reserves of publicly listed companies are unburnable if the world is to have a chance of not exceeding global warming of 2 degrees C. So it's clear that we've used up our fossil fuel budget. There are other issues as well in relation to the expansion of fossil fuel resources. As I mentioned about the destruction of indigenous sites in the Laird Forest, and there are some in the Pilliga as well. These kinds of projects, as we've seen in Queensland and other places, distort local economies. particularly affect property values. There's a boom and bust cycle that occurs there. The bulk of the profits from these activities go overseas. These companies make a very poor contribution to society through taxation, nil or minimal tax paid. A lot of the royalties are returned by state governments in various forms of subsidies, and it's quite clear that the Commonwealth Government subsidises the fossil fuel industry as a whole, and I think it was the World Bank who said that in 2015 that amounted to $40 million. But underlying all of what I've said to this point is my Christian faith. I sometimes say to people that I believe that all Christians should be environmentalists and activists, and I base this on a number of things, including the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. There are lots of verses that remind us about the responsibility that humans have for nature. Places like Genesis 2:15 and 3:17 to 19 highlight that humanity is called to be the gardener and tiller of the earth, and to have the task of keeping it fertile and productive. And this emphasises the need to care for rather than to exploit and plunder the earth. Romans 8:13 to 28 tells us that the whole of creation and humanity long and groan for perfection and liberation. Violence against creation caused by disobedience and greed will have to be redeemed in Christ. And there are lots of verses in Scripture that tell us about God's attitude towards creation. Genesis 1:21 says that God delights in the diversity of species and pronounces them good. God values and cares for even the smallest of creatures, as we see in Matthew 10:29. Creation should be treated in a way that will allow it to be preserved and to regenerate. Deuteronomy 22:6 and 7. God sustains creation. Psalm 145:15 to 16 and Matthew 6:26 and 30. God's will was that all species should be preserved so that they could regenerate. Genesis 6:19 and 20, chapter 7 verse 3 and chapter 8 verse 17. And God has covenanted not to destroy creation, as we see in Genesis 9:8 to 17. I guess the umbrella for all of that for me is love your neighbour as yourself. And as we know, that first appears in Leviticus 19:18, and then it appears in Matthew, Mark and Luke, where Jesus tells us that it's one of the two greatest commandments. Paul says that it sums up all the other commandments, and James calls it the royal law. The writer Sally McFaig asks, what if we understood oneself not to stop at the edges of one's own body, but to extend without limit to include everything that is? What if the neighbour is not only the person next door, but all of creation, everything that exists? What would it mean to love this neighbour as one loves oneself? Like many other Christians, I interpret the word neighbour to include not just the people who live next door, but all of humanity. Not just the ones who are alive now, but the ones in the generations to follow. And I also include all living creatures and the environments in which they live, such as oceans and forests. I feel that by protesting about what is happening in the Laird Forest or the Pilliga Forest, I am loving my neighbour. I'm proud to be a member of the Uniting Church, which since its inception has taken seriously its role as an agent of care for creation, and it's issued a number of statements since its very beginning to that effect. One good example, of course, is the 2006 National Assembly call on the Church to reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions and to advocate for governments to implement policies to reduce Australia's dependence on fossil fuels. I'm proud to be a member of Uniting Earthweb and Uniting Eco Group, It was the Eco Group which sponsored the divestment proposal to Synod in 2013. And in the last couple of years, we've produced a couple of leaflets setting out the Church's position on CSG and coal. I'm also a member of ARC, which has members from the Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist and other faiths, as well as Christians, of course, and that's helped me to realise that care for creation is a part of just about every religious faith. I see this as a social justice issue as well as an ecological justice issue. It's a matter of justice for my neighbours, the people of Kiribati and Tuvalu, the farmers and residents of Maules Creek and the Pilliga, and all the other communities threatened by dirty coal and gas. And of course the koalas, the frogs, the birds and the other creatures living in the laird and pitata forests. I'm convinced that as a Christian minister, a father and a grandfather, I've got a responsibility to do my bit to ensure that the environment that my grandchildren and great-grandchildren have to live in is bearable and sustainable. So that was the content of the talk that I gave, and we had a Q&A afterwards, and one of the questions that was asked was about how do you keep going in a campaign like that, and that was interesting for me because I'd been listening to the podcasts that have been prepared for this e-seminar in the car on the way up to Lithgow, and heard Jason's interview with the Groundswell Gloucester people, and Jason asked a similar question there, and it seemed to me that one of the answers given that day was similar to what I would say in that situation, that when you're convinced that something is right and it's something that's got to be done, that if the particular proposal that you're protesting against goes ahead, that it will be terrible for all sorts of reasons, then somehow you just find the reserves to keep doing what has to be done. It is difficult to maintain hope in some of those situations, and I know I guess I was sort of on the periphery to some extent of those campaigns up there in the time that I was there, and some of the people, particularly some of the Laird Forest protesters, suffered burnout because particularly the ones who'd been there from the very beginning and were quite dispirited when, after 3 years of intense effort, it was obvious that the Whitehaven mine was going to go ahead regardless. And I recently visited the northwest and spoke to some of the people there, and some of them are quite tired too of the effort that's required to keep the campaign going, even though they've had lots of great results in terms of surveying farmers in the area and getting well into the 90s of people being opposed to the Santos project going ahead. Every time there's some news about some positive development from the Santos point of view, it's like a kick in the guts. But we've got to hope that that right will prevail, and keep hoping and keep going.